Hello, my name is Phil Cornish, and I'm your host of Cornish Talks Common Sense. Is our society unraveling? Why? What can we do about it? Come back in a minute and we'll talk to you about that subject. Welcome back. I'm Phil Cornish, and I am your host of Cornish Talks Common Sense. It is a program about current events that are happening in our world today from a perspective that gives you insight into truth, from a perspective that is Judeo-Christian based, and we're going to talk about a lot of difficult and important issues. We do this unrehearsed and with no teleprompter, so we're going to try to make this communicated to you in a way that hopefully is interesting and understandable for you to watch. So, as mentioned, the topic that I'm going to deal with today is called the Great Unraveling. Is our society unraveling? And there's lots of reasons why we might think that's the case today. We have war in Ukraine, we have COVID, we have other issues that are happening like inflation and debt, and all of these things are in many ways causing us to lose our cohesion as a society. And so I want to talk to you today about why that is. How did we get to that place, and what, if anything, can we do about it? So just this week I happened to look again at a periodical publication that I had obtained at a used bookstore actually a while ago, and I happened to be reviewing it again. And it's from the American Scholar, a 2005 edition, and an article by a gentleman called Edward Hoagland. And the title of his article is called, "Where Has the Glue Gone?" And what he was talking about is, where is that adhesive, that binding element of our society that keeps us together, that helps us to function as a cohesive society? And his thesis is that that is quickly disappearing, and he gives some reasons why that is the case. Now, I don't agree with all his reasons, but I think his topic is right on the money. So today I want to talk to you about this idea that our society is unraveling, the cohesiveness of our communities, of our civilization as a whole is floundering and fracturing. So what happened to bring that scenario about? Well, for the answer, you have to understand the three premises that I've talked to you about in some past programs. I'll just remind you of, again, today, three core symptoms that have taken place in our society in recent years that are leading to an unraveling of our society. So the first of those is what I call the advent of postmodernism. And so postmodernism is a theory that really is largely credited to Jacques Derrida, late 1950s, 1960s. And he theorized that our society can no longer depend on one idea of absolute truth, that instead everything is relative. You have your own truth, and you can have your truth, and I can have my truth. And so everything is seen through a subjective lens. There's no absolute truth. And so that is one underpinning of what is ailing our society today. A second point is something I call the elevation of feelings. And so the field of psychiatry and the growing idea of trauma, and having feelings and emotions dominate over reason and rational and critical thinking has come to have undue influence in our world today. And you see that with protests like BLM, with the abortion protesters following the Roe and Wade reversal in the Dobbs decision by the United States Supreme Court and so we see people being driven by their emotions, and it's led to violence and confrontation, and that is a growing trend in our society. That's number two. The third point that I've talked about before is what I've called the abandonment of eschatology. Well, what is this big word, eschatology? Well, that is the idea that there actually is a unfolding of a plan according to the design of a deity, God, that unfolds according to what he describes and recounts in the Bible. Now, of course, today, people have declared God is dead, or at least largely irrelevant. And so that is why today people don't really have any concern for the idea that there is a plan for mankind that God has. Instead, we have people that are concerned about climate change, for example, so that people are concerned that the world's going to end if we don't fix it, if we can't cure all the environmental ills that are happening, our world is going to end. And so they completely discount that there's any other factor involved supernaturally, but rather it's us. Mankind has to try to fix everything. And again, that reminded me of a saying that I've used before on a program, and that is the old Jewish proverb that says that what makes God laugh, and that is man planning. Because we think we know how to conquer nature and fix all of the problems that exist in our world today. But sadly, that is a view that is just ill-founded. So those are three premises that I'm going to start with, because I'm going to argue they will help us to understand all the events that occur in our world today and why they're occurring. And so if we want to get a grasp of what's going on, we need to understand these three underlying premises. So where have we arrived at today in our present world? Why are we going through the kinds of fragmentation of our society that I've referenced? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that one of the chief underlying factors is that our Western civilization is seeking to replace its Judeo-Christian foundations with pluralistic, multicultural values that are grounded really in what I would call secular humanism. So one of the important things to understand is that every one of us has a world view. In other words, how we think about our world, how we devise our behavior, in how we act and function and conduct ourselves is based on some kind of underlying ideology that you follow. Now, you may not even recognize it formally. It may be somewhat subconscious and not overtly conscious in your mind. But I guarantee you that every one of us has an ideology that we order our lives by. Now, the dominant one that has taken place with the advent of postmodernism is what I've called secular humanism. And so the idea there is we're all we've got, humans are it, and we have to guide ourselves by our own rational thought. The problem is that we're not so rational as we think we are. We're governed by emotions and feelings, as I've said, that often displace our thinking and reasoning ability. So secular humanism has divested our society really about thinking about God. And so, of course, you'll be familiar probably with the Nietzschean thinking or creed that God is dead. And that is something that has had a overwhelming influence on how most people function in our world today. And so the secular humanists are only concerned about human flourishing, about mankind doing what they think is good. And that's driven by a couple of items that have found their way to become insinuated into our society today. And those two things are the following. The first of those I would characterize as what we would call globalism. So that is the idea of what I would call a one world community. There's a book that I read some time ago. I quoted from it in a book I wrote now going on 30 years ago called Now Through a Glass Darkly. And it's a book called Building a World Community by a secular humanist named Paul Kurtz. And he talks about strategizing towards getting rid of national governments and eventually working towards, a one world government system. And this underlying thinking is more pervasive than you might be aware of. For example, it's the underlying platform of what happens in Davos. You've probably heard of the Davos Forum in Switzerland, where they typically, on an annual basis, have a conference of the world's elite, leaders of banks and governments and corporations that go to Davos and talk about how they can enhance and increase the role of globalization in our world. So that is one of the underlying themes that exists with the secular humanism perspective. A second is the new mantra that has now come to be very popular that we call diversity, inclusion, and equity. Now, we used to call it diversity, inclusion, and equality, but someone's changed the word from equality to equity. Regardless, it's pretty difficult to really understand really what these words actually mean. I pulled up an article just in preparation for this program this week, which is from an author who is from a university in Halifax, Mount St. Vincent University, Stephen Parrott, who's a professor of psychology there. And he dug into a little bit of where does this mantra of diversity, inclusion, and equity that we hear everywhere now, where does it come from? And his research tells him that it really only became popular since about 2007 to 2013 is when it kind of took off in popularity. And now it is everywhere. Corporations, governments, everywhere you look, there are codes of enforcing diversity, inclusion, and equity. So the question then becomes, so really, what is that? What is diversity, inclusion, and equity? And what you find, though, is that those values really are not as clear-cut as what you would think that they are. So how do we grapple with these underlying themes that have taken the place of Judeo-Christian thinking today and really have come to be a religion of their own? So the idea of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and of building a world community is that we have to get rid of the thinking that divides people into ethnicities and national groups and instead make us all into one homogeneous group of people that can function ultimately with what is hoped to be a one world type of government. So how is this secular form of religion functioning? Well, we see it in critical race theory, something that I've already talked to you about before, a paradigm of thinking that was largely created by Harvard law professor Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, who talk about the injustices of the oppressor against the oppressed, and talk about gender dysphoria and climate change and just generally self-absorbed behavior that is what's governing their line of thinking. Everything is seen through the lens of empowerment. In other words, everything is all about achieving power and claiming rights, and that is the governing force of much of what is seen in our world today. And so becoming a victim and claiming victimhood is really, it's become a currency that people trade on. If you're a victim, then you're oppressed, and you can now assert rights against those who you deem have oppressed you. And that's a thinking that we see happening more and more. And you might recall a name of a philosopher that I've given in a past program who really is the primary person who espoused that kind of thinking. And that's Michel Foucault, the French philosopher who categorized virtually everything in life as either being an oppressor or an oppressed person. And through that lens and that model, Michel Foucault said everything functions. And the question is he right? And was he accurate? I brought a book with me today called Suspicious Minds by an author named Dowbiggin. And I want to just turn to a couple sections to talk about Michel Foucault. And Michel Foucault is a person who, frankly, ought not to be the mentor for as many as have followed him in our world today. Let me read a couple passages of what Dowbiggin says. He says, Foucault was committed to the view that a person defines himself through experience only, and the more intense the experience, the better, any experience. Foucault was obsessed with death, suicide, sexuality, and violence, especially any combination thereof. His heroes included the deranged pornographer, the Marquis de Sade. His favorite visions included the haunted, infernal images of the painter Goya. He preferred locales where the gay bathhouses of San Francisco and Toronto, where sex was anonymous and open to unmitigated fantasy. Foucault wrote the final chapter of his autobiography in 1983 as he was dying of AIDS, and hot rumors that he had purposefully frequented bathhouses even after he had learned he was HIV positive. So, that is the underlying piece of the life of Michel Foucault that you won't hear in the media. Instead, what you hear is how he has been the model principally for feminists and those who want to claim rights in our society by overthrowing the existing foundations of our society. Let me read a section about that. He says, gender feminist version of patriarchy borrows heavily from Foucault's writings. Foucault shared how one could demonize something as complex and multidimensional as modern medicine. Gender feminists would cite his series as precedent for demonizing patriarchy. In Foucault's worldview, sweeping generalizations are not only possible but often true. Like Foucault, the gender feminists picture themselves as engaged in a momentous struggle. They seek to overthrow the Goliath of patriarchy. All the rules can be challenged, all boundaries transgressed, because the stakes are absolute power. Foucault was obsessed with power. Sex to him is really about power, not biology, and it could be literally liberating. Accordingly, Foucault saw gay liberation as an avenue that led to concrete emancipation. But sex, being ultimately about power, could also be a means of subordination. To gender feminists, heterosexuality was one of patriarchy's favorite techniques of oppression. And he goes on to talk about how the family, the structure of the basic family, what history has always known as the basic building block of society, is really patriarchal in nature and has to be overthrown. And so just the very idea of the family is at odds with the kind of thinking that Foucault espoused and is followed now by those who are pursuing feminism and a trans gender agenda and so on, which are issues that dominate in our media today and which I've talked to you a little bit about before in past programs. So, is there anything new under the sun? Is this really just a new thing, or have we seen this before? Let's just take a break for a moment and I'll come right back and tell you the answer to that question. Welcome back. So today we're talking on Cornish Talks Common Sense about an overarching theme of, is our society unraveling? Now, lots of different perspectives on that, depending who you talk to. I watched a show on CNN on the Michel show this morning that talked about that kind of a theme. You know, is society falling apart? He had a guest on named Steven Pinker. I've got almost every one of Steven Pinker's books. He is a psychologist from MIT who's written a number of books basically saying, well, the human race is actually doing pretty well. And I would beg to differ with his philosophy. And I think any reasonable person surveying the world today sees all the things happening in Ukraine and with BLM and all the fracturing of society that I've been recounting to you that is happening. And so I think we have a lot to be concerned about in our world today. So why have these fractures occurred? Critical race theory, gender dysphoria, climate change, just generally a feeling of self-absorption that has manifested itself in claiming of rights. That kind of thinking has come to dominate. And I've given you some background reasons of why that is so. And a lot of it falls at the feet of two important philosophers, Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, who have been grasped by many and used to facilitate their theories of how to become empowered and viewing everything through the lens of either being oppressed or being the oppressor. So, is this anything new, or is this something we've seen before? Well, I'm going to suggest to you this goes all the way back to the book of Genesis, chapter 11 in the Bible, with the story about the Tower of Babel, where it talks about people who tried to get together to build their own kingdom unto heaven and to reach a utopia, effectively. And so we know the result that God speaks of there. He said that that's when human languages were changed and people went to all quarters of the world because of their dream of building a human utopia. So I am here to tell you today that this promised utopia that secular humanism and those espousing that kind of theory would suggest is unattainable. That in fact, rather, we are in a period heading towards a dystopia, and the dream of utopia is a delusion. And that is the case because our human nature is degraded. And I would accept the Hobbesian view, if you will, that says that human nature is really a depraved nature, but it's not Hobbes that we can look to for that. Again, the Bible talks to us about human nature and how we have fallen. And so that fundamentally is the explanation of why we see war and famine and pestilence, disease, and crime and corruption, all these things that in fact I talk about 30 years ago in a book that I wrote. Many of the things which are absolutely coming true and happening today are found in words that I wrote 30 years ago. And so if we want to understand why this is happening, a prime example is in Romans chapter 1 of the Bible, where it talks about mankind has come to worship the creation and the creatures that are in creation rather than the creator. And so that tells us a lot. And climate change is particularly one area where we see that happening today. People are only concerned about our world. How can we save it? What can we do to stop global warming? What can we do to stop climate change and hurricanes and other adverse events that happen? And the reality is that we deceive ourselves and we delude ourselves to think that we are empowered to be able to make those kind of changes and to control our world in that way. And that takes us to one other passage I'm just going to share with you briefly in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 of the Bible, where it talks about that there will be a day and age, and I'm going to suggest that we're arriving at that, where it says that God will send a strong delusion to people because they've not wanted to know the truth, and they've been fooled into false philosophies and following false gods of this world that are lies and delusion, because they would rather believe that than believe in the idea that there is actually a God. So if we understand the signs of the times of what's happening in our world, there is an explanation for what is happening. The problem is we've deluded ourselves, we've become self-deceived into following philosophies like secular humanism, what the Germans called Weltanschauung, their idea of a worldview that that is followed, that removes God and deletes him from any relevance in our world, and instead makes mankind in charge. And the result is what we see: a false notion of utopia, and instead a world that is frankly unraveling, as I've suggested to you in the start of our program. So thank you for your attention today, and hopefully we'll be back again soon with another episode.